Hi, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you. If you're returning, thanks for coming back. I'm excited to see you again. Welcome back to my third installment of What the F is Going On. We're going through all of King Henry VIII's wives, and today we're on wife number 3, which is Jane Seymour. But on Saturdays, I figured we'd talk about anything paranormal or just strange in general, paranormal, conspiracy theory, strange history, just anything like that, anything that I feel like I want to talk about that week. So if that's something you're interested in, you can go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below and the little bell icon so you can be notified when I upload. But yeah, I do want to give a quick warning that some of the things that we talk about here can be pretty heavy. So if that's something your mental health cannot handle, just go ahead and click off this video and we'll catch you somewhere else. But your mental health will always be more important than any YouTube video ever will be. I am doing my makeup while talking about this, and then I'm going to record my Tuesday video. So just a forewarning, I am not a makeup artist. I'm not claiming to be a makeup artist. I'm just doing my makeup for what suits me. I know there is a theory behind makeup. I do not know that theory, so don't come for me. I am just having some fun. So Jane was either born in October of 1507 or October of 1508. She was the 7th child and the first daughter of John Seymour and Lady Margaret. So they probably thought that her date of birth was not very important, so they didn't record it anywhere. Which, how your child's birthday not being important is a thing, I'm not sure, but times were just different back then. So her father, John Seymour, had a pretty impressive military career, and he was married to someone who was a descendant of King Edward III, so they weren't, like, really prominent, but since John Seymour had such an impressive military career, he had gained the respect of King Henry, and so there was that. But it did seem that John Seymour was more concerned with his sons, and he wanted them to have the same kind of military career that he had, so he would spend money on his sons, educating them in military tactics and those kinds of things, and helping build their careers, while his daughters just kind of got left behind. Jane's education would have been minimal at best. She would have learned how to read in English, and she would have learned how to sign her name, but her education would have been more in like dancing and hosting parties and like keep a household running. Back in those times, your class was determined by how much housework you did. So noble women and men did no housework at all, and that was left to the servants. While the middle class was kind of left to do their own thing, so their family was definitely middle class because they did keep their household running with probably the help of several servants because they did have a larger household. But Jane was educated in sewing, and she was a seamstress, and she was notably a very good seamstress. But yeah, that was the extent of her education. She wasn't really taught in anything else. She might have known a little bit of French and a couple words in Latin, but that's pretty much it. But Jane did love, she was considered to be an excellent horsewoman, and she was also very good at hunting, and she quite enjoyed these things. But yeah, she was mostly trained up on how to be a housewife. The Seymour family was a very religious family. They were Catholic and didn't really agree with Queen Anne's approach to things. They were not happy with the changes being made in the English church. The fact that King Henry had broken away from the Roman Catholic Church and had now made himself the head of the Church of England. They were very religious in their beliefs, and Jane would have been as well. She would have been very Catholic, and yeah. Jane did have one other attempt at marriage before King Henry, and this was to just a basic knight. But her family did not have a dowry to give to the knight's family, so this marriage kind of fizzled out. It seemed that the Seymour family was spending all of their money on their son's education in the military, and their daughters were just kind of left alone, like I said, and so they were not able to give a dowry to this family, which kind of just made this whole engagement fizzle out. So by the time Jane was in her late 20s, she was still not married, which was kind of strange because most women or girls would get married as soon as they hit puberty, so like 15 years old, some even younger. So by the time Jane was in her late 20s, she still wasn't married, so her family sent her to be a lady in waiting to Catherine of Aragon. And I'm sorry, I misspoke. She would have been about 19 at the time. So when she was 19 years old, she went to go be a lady in waiting to Catherine of Aragon. And the reason her family sent her there is they were hoping that she would find a good suitor while she was there. And little did they know what they were getting her into. Jane made it to the courts in 1527. This would have been around the same time that Anne Boleyn made it there. But Jane was more quiet and reserved, as we know now that Anne was more of a not loud, I don't want to say loud. She was just opinionated. She had her opinions and she wanted them to be known, and there is nothing wrong with that. But Jane was more quiet, and so she kept all of her opinions about what was happening with Catherine of Aragon and Henry, and then later Anne and Henry. She kept all of her opinions to herself. But after Catherine of Aragon and Henry would divorce, Jane became a lady in waiting to Anne Boleyn. Now, while Jane is really known for her quiet and mousy demeanor, it seems like maybe she was a little bit more ambitious than people give her credit for. No one knows exactly when, how, or why Jane and Henry started a little bit of a flirtation, but they did. And this could have possibly happened around the time that Anne became pregnant with their second child. So Anne and Henry's second child. And like I said previously, it was pretty typical for a king to have mistresses, especially while the queen was pregnant, because it was considered dangerous to have relations while the queen was pregnant. But there are rumors that during the day that Catherine's funeral was happening, that Henry was seen giving very special attention to Anne, giving her gifts, and just spending more time with her than he was anyone else. There is also a story that was told that the same day of Catherine's funeral, that Anne walked in on Jane and Henry having an intimate moment, and Anne flew into a rage, and Henry excused Jane from the room and tried to calm Anne down because he was afraid something would happen to their unborn baby. So do you remember Thomas Cromwell from last week's episode? He was the man that genuinely hated Anne Boleyn and wanted to see her out of Henry's life. Well, it's unknown if Henry and Jane started their relationship prior, and then Thomas Cromwell and all of his little cronies noticed it and approached Jane, trying to see if maybe she could win Henry's heart to kind of restore England to the way it had been before Anne came along. So they don't know if they just noticed the relationship kind of blossoming between Jane and Henry, or if they approached Jane before Henry and Jane started seeing each other and wanting her to kind of win Henry's heart and restore England to the way it was. But either way, this Seymour fellow was really interested in seeing Jane as queen, probably because she was so submissive and quiet. And at this point, Anne knew something was going on. Not only had she walked in on them having an intimate moment, but she could just tell that she was falling out of favor with the king. And she seemed pretty jealous of Jane. But there's also a couple stories of Jane possibly flaunting her relationship with King Henry. Apparently, King Henry gave her a locket with a portrait of himself inside, and she was seen opening it and closing it in front of Anne Boleyn. And then eventually Anne flew into a rage and ripped the locket off her neck, cutting her finger in the process. But Anne didn't want to get rid of Jane because she knew she was already on thin ice with Henry, and so she didn't want to do anything else that would make him angry. But Jane probably did hate Anne. Jane probably blamed Anne for the change in the church and the creation of the Church of England and the moving away from the Roman Church, which changed the religion in England drastically since she was such a devout Catholic girl. Many people really did hate Anne, and they really blamed her for the changes in the church. So this is not a far out possibility that maybe she was kind of trying to antagonize Anne a little bit. But no one really truly knows when their relationship actually started. And no one really knows if it started organically, like Henry just noticed Jane and decided to pursue her, or if it was other people who wanted Anne out of the kingdom that were kind of pushing them together and planting seeds in Henry's mind. But it was also kind of strange that Henry decided to start seeing Jane. Jane was not somebody that was well educated. Like I said before, she was just kind of meek and quiet. And Henry's other wives had been very well educated and very opinionated and were able to speak their minds. So it was kind of strange that Henry decided to go from one extreme to the other. And it was probably because he was getting tired of Anne and her opinions. So the idea of being with someone who was submissive and quiet was probably alluring to him. Maybe she was meek and quiet and just so happened to catch the eye of the king, but maybe she was also playing the same hand that Anne had. At this point, Jane was accepting gifts from the king, and she was enjoying his company, and yeah, it just seemed like she was interested in Henry. There is a story of Henry sending Anne a letter and a bag full of gold. And when this came to her, reportedly, Jane kissed the seal of the letter and then sent it back saying that she would not give up her modesty, and she begged the forgiveness of the king, but she would not give up her modesty. And this is kind of exactly what Anne did by kind of enticing Henry and then saying, no, I'm only saving myself for the king. So kind of playing hard to get and Henry falling for it. Well, Jane did the same thing and Henry once again fell for it. So maybe Jane was hoping for the same kind of outcome that Anne had gotten when she played hard to get. And it did work because Henry was so impressed with her modesty that he said that he would no longer see her alone. He would always make sure that they were properly chaperoned, and he even moved Thomas Cromwell out of his office and gave it to Jane's brother so that he could properly chaperone their dates. But this didn't stop the rumor mill from rumor milling, and people started to talk about the affair. During this time, Henry left the palace that he shared with Anne, and he started being more serious about his relationship with Jane. He then moved Jane out of that palace and moved her to her own private estate, and he would visit her often there. The morning of Anne's execution, that day, he went to visit Jane, and he told her not to worry, that they would soon be married. And I think he kind of kept Jane in the dark about what was happening. Jane probably knew that Anne was being executed, but she more than likely didn't know the full extent of what was happening. And just like Henry said, the day after Anne was executed, him and Jane were betrothed to be married. And just 2 weeks after this, on May 30th of 1536, they were married in a semi-private ceremony. And so very quickly after Anne's death, they were married. So it really leads many people to believe that Anne might have been executed because he wanted to marry Jane. And that makes more sense to me because he had such a hard time getting divorced from Catherine of Aragon. Maybe in his brain, he was thinking it'd just be easier if Anne was dead. So let me accuse her of treason, falsely accuse her of treason. That way I can get out of this marriage and then marry Jane. That's my thought. Because you also have to remember that he had had this head injury where he fell off his horse and was unconscious for 2 hours. After this head injury, his personality changes completely and he becomes more paranoid and angry and mean. So in my mind, I think what makes sense is he's it was really hard to divorce Catherine. I don't want to go through that again, so I'm just going to kill her. That's my thought process. Jane and Henry were now married, and Jane was very kind to one of her stepchildren, which was Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter. And this is probably because Mary was also very Catholic and didn't agree with King Henry's leaving the the Roman Catholic Church and starting the Church of England. And so she was trying to suggest that Henry and Mary kind of resolve their relationship, and she wanted Mary to become an heir to the throne. That way they could usher back in Catholicism the way it had been before Anne Boleyn. And many scholars think that this is exactly why she was trying to reunite Mary and Henry, so that she would be the heir and bring back the old ways of Catholicism the way they had known it originally. But every time Jane would bring this up, Henry would just kind of scoff at it and blow her off. He said that the only way he would make things right with Mary is if Mary would denounce the Roman Catholic Church and say that Henry was the true leader of the Church of England. And Mary didn't seem willing to do this. She didn't really want to do this. Now let's switch over to Elizabeth, which was Anne's daughter. She was only 4 years old when Anne was executed, and she was neglected so bad. Like, I think she was fed and stuff and did have a caretaker, but like if she grew out of her clothes, no one would think to make her any new clothes. And Jane didn't like Elizabeth. She didn't pay any attention to Elizabeth and just kind of blew her off. And this might have been because of her hatred of Anne. So it was actually Mary, Catherine's daughter, that started making sure that Elizabeth was taken care of. And it was probably because she felt sympathy for the child, because she probably understood that this 4-year-old kid has no clue what's going on and is not to be and can't be blamed for what's going on, so she shouldn't suffer. But either way. But Jane was still trying to convince Henry to have compassion for people who wanted to, restore Catholicism back to how it originally was before Anne. Even when there was an uprising of people, Jane tried to get Henry to have compassion for these people, but it didn't seem to be working. It didn't seem like he wanted to have compassion for these people, and it seemed like he was relishing in his power. Okay, I just finished everything off camera. I feel like one eye's messed up, but it's okay. But anyway, Jane became pregnant in 1537 in the early part of the year, so maybe around January. And Henry was over the moon excited. He was making all of these big plans for a coronation, and he was just really excited that she was pregnant, hoping that this time he was getting his male heir. Jane went into labor later that year in October, and Henry was absolutely ecstatic, making big plans to mark the celebration of his son. But Jane was in labor for a few days. And so a couple of days went by. Finally, early, 3 days later, the baby was born, and this time it was a son. And Jane was very weak from this labor and delivery, and so it took a couple of days for her to be able to come out of her confinement. And when she did, people marked that she looked more pale than usual, and she looked weak and drained, but they were expecting a full recovery. A couple of days after she came out of her confinement, she fell ill with a raging fever. And for a couple of days, she would seem to rally and kind of come back to life, but then she died, very unfortunately, a couple of days after her son was born. There is a theory out there that Jane was given a C-section. C-sections were very taboo during that time, and they were only ever performed after a woman had died during childbirth, and they were hoping to be able to save the baby. But there is some speculation that maybe Jane was given a C-section, and the utensils that they used were not cleaned properly, because medieval times, obviously. And so Jane actually got sepsis from it, and that's what caused her death. The thing is they would have had to ask King Henry if he was okay with a C-section, and there are some rumors that said that he chose Jane, and there are other rumors that said that he chose the baby. But at this point, Henry was not a kind man anymore, so I would have a hard time believing that he would choose Jane, since he was so desperate for a male heir at this point. But he did get his son. They named him Edward. There is some speculation that Jane is the only wife that King Henry truly loved, but I disagree. I think he really did love Catherine, and I do think he loved Anne in his own way. But Jane might have held a special spot in his heart, because after she died, he ordered that all of her emblems and portraits be taken from the castle, and he did request to be buried next to Jane. And then after that, he never spoke of Jane again. So I'm not sure, but what are your thoughts? Do you think that Jane was using the same playbook that Anne had used, or do you think that she just happened to catch the king's eye because she was so different from any woman he had previously been married to? Also, do you think that maybe she did have a C-section performed on her and that's what led to her death? Or what are your thoughts on that? I'd love to know them down in the comments. And so yeah, that's all I have for you today. So happy you joined me, and I'm really excited to maybe see you next week. Just another reminder to hit the subscribe button down below, the little bell icon, and like if you want to. So yeah, I will see you next time, and I'm sending you so much love. Bye.